There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. A Tuesday evening, a shared couch, the low murmur of a television playing a movie neither of you is watching. They don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets. They slip in through the quietest of doors, and it's only much later, when you look back, that you realize you are standing in a completely different room, a different house, a different life entirely. You can trace the entire architecture of your future back to a single, weightless second. For me, that second was suspended in the space between a joke and a confession, and it sounded like a single word, a name that wasn't mine. Night, baby. The words were a soft exhalation against the back of my neck, a puff of warm air that was gone as quickly as it arrived. Liam was already shifting, pulling the worn gray blanket higher over his shoulder as he settled deeper into the cushions of our sofa, his back pressed firmly against my chest. His breathing evened out almost instantly, a slow, rhythmic tide that I had come to know as well as my own. He was asleep, and I was left wide awake in the blue-white glow of the screen, with that one word echoing in the sudden, vast silence of my own mind. Baby. It had started as a joke, a piece of casual, almost mocking affection a few weeks ago. He'd been pouting about a failed coding attempt on some personal project, and I'd brought him a beer without him asking. He'd taken it, knocked his shoulder against mine, and said, "Ah, you always know what I need." "Thanks, baby," he'd grinned, that wide, easy grin that always seemed to take up his whole face, and I'd felt a familiar, painful squeeze in my chest. A joke. Of course, it was a joke. Liam was all casual touches and easy, affectionate nicknames for everyone. It meant nothing. Except, he kept saying it. And then, he stopped saying anything else. For 3 weeks, for days, and roughly 7 hours, he hadn't used my real name. Not once. He hadn't called me Julian. He had only called me baby. I met Liam during the first week of my sophomore year of college, in the chaotic, fluorescent-lit purgatory of the university housing office. My assigned roommate had, without warning, decided to transfer to a school 1,000 miles away, leaving me with an empty room and a looming deadline to either find a new roommate or be randomly assigned one by the housing lottery, a fate I, with my deep-seated need for quiet and control, was desperate to avoid. I was standing at the counter, trying to plead my case for a single room I couldn't afford, when a whirlwind of kinetic energy blew in through the doors. He was all broad shoulders and damp hair, smelling faintly of chlorine and frantic energy, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. He bypassed the entire line, strode right up to the counter next to me, and planted his hands on the laminate surface. His own roommate, it turned out, had been caught selling questionable substances out of their dorm and had been summarily expelled. We were two halves of an administrative problem. The housing coordinator, a woman with a perpetually weary expression, looked from his desperate, pleading face to my quiet, resigned one, and a flicker of inspiration, or perhaps just exhaustion, crossed her features. She pointed a pin between us. An hour later, I was helping Liam move a duffel bag full of swimsuits and a truly alarming number of protein powder tubs into the empty side of my room. Our friendship shouldn't have worked. On paper, we were a study in contrasts. I was a photographer, a creature of shadow and light, of quiet observation and long, patient hours spent in the silent, chemical-scented solitude of the darkroom. My world was about capturing moments, freezing them, studying the emotions held within a still frame. Liam's world was one of explosive, forward motion. He was a competitive swimmer, a nationally ranked backstroker whose life was measured in split seconds and governed by the relentless discipline of pre-dawn practices and punishing training regimens. He moved through the world with an unthinking confidence, a physical ease that I, who was always conscious of the space my body occupied, could only marvel at. He was loud where I was quiet, spontaneous where I was deliberate, an open book where I was a locked diary. Yet, from the very beginning, something just fit. It was a strange and easy alchemy. He respected my need for silence, learning to use headphones when I was editing photos, and I learned to appreciate the constant, thrumming energy he brought into our space, a vital warmth that kept the shadows from growing too deep. We built a life in that small dorm room, and later in the slightly larger, slightly less dilapidated 2-bedroom apartment we moved into after graduation. It was a life built on a foundation of takeout containers, mismatched socks, the faint, ever-present scent of chlorine from his gear and fixer from my darkroom, and a deep, unspoken understanding. He was the only person who could pull me out of a depressive spiral with a stupid joke and a demand for pizza, and I was the only person he'd talk to about the crushing pressure of shaving a tenth of a second off his time. He was my anchor, and I, in some strange way, was his harbor. The problem, the secret fault line running beneath the sturdy foundation of our friendship, was that I had fallen in love with him somewhere along the way. It wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic event. It was a slow, creeping dawn. It was in the way the afternoon light would catch the beads of water on his shoulders when he came home from practice. It was in the low, concentrated hum he'd make when he was trying to solve a coding problem for his day job as a software consultant. It was in the moments I'd catch myself staring, my camera forgotten in my lap, just watching him exist across the living room, so completely and utterly alive. I hid it, of course. I buried it deep, packed it down like volatile soil, and built my life on top of it. He was my best friend. He was, as far as I knew, completely and unshakably straight, with a string of pleasant but forgettable girlfriends who would drift in and out of our lives like passing seasons. To risk the comfortable, essential piece of our friendship for a love that could never be returned felt like a form of self-destruction I wasn't brave enough to attempt. So I learned to live with the quiet ache, the constant, low-grade yearning. I became an expert at translating my feelings into a language he could understand: friendship. A hand on his shoulder was support, not a touch I wanted to let linger. Sitting next to him on the couch was companionship, not a desperate attempt to close an unbearable distance. I was a master of platonic affection, a scholar of the unspoken boundary. And for years, it was enough. It had to be. The shift began on a rainy Thursday in October. Liam had been training for months for the Olympic trials, a singular goal that had consumed his entire life since he was a kid. It was the culmination of everything: the 4 a.m. alarms, the missed parties, the aching muscles, the life deferred. His entire sense of self was tied up in the turbulent water of the competitive pool. He was so close, his times consistently placing him in the top 3 contenders. We all thought it was a certainty. I had my camera bag packed, ready to fly out and document what I was sure would be his moment of triumph. But that afternoon, he came home hours earlier than expected. He didn't slam the door or throw his bag down, which would have been his usual way of expressing frustration. He closed it so softly, I barely heard the click of the latch. I was in the kitchen, making coffee, and I turned to see him standing in the hallway, dripping water onto the worn wooden floor. He wasn't just wet from the rain. His face was pale, his eyes vacant, stripped of their usual fire. He looked hollowed out, like a building after a fire, the structure still standing, but everything inside turned to ash. "I missed it," he said, and his voice was a ghost, a thin, reedy sound that the rain outside seemed to swallow whole. "Missed what?" I asked, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "The cut," he whispered. He wouldn't look at me. He just stared at a spot on the wall somewhere over my shoulder. "By 7/100ths of a second. 4th place. I got 4th place. 4th place." The cruelest position in a race with 3 spots on the team. Close enough to taste it, to feel the phantom victory, but ultimately, just another spectator. In the world of elite athletics, 4th place was the same as last. It was nothing. I saw his entire world, the one he had so carefully constructed out of discipline and ambition, shatter in that single moment. The confident, easygoing Liam I knew vanished, replaced by this fragile, stunned stranger who looked like he might be carried away by the slightest breeze. I didn't know what to do. All my carefully constructed gestures of friendship felt flimsy and inadequate in the face of a grief this monumental. So I just stood there, my hand still on the coffee pot, until he finally looked at me. His eyes were wide and lost, like a child's. "I don't know what to do now, Jules," he said, and the use of my name, my actual name, felt like a plea. That night was the first time the old rules began to dissolve. After a long, scalding shower, he emerged wrapped in a towel, looking marginally more human, but no less broken. He bypassed his own room and walked into the living room, where I was pretending to read a book. He didn't say anything. He just picked up the spare blanket from the armchair, sat down on the far end of the sofa, and wrapped it around himself. An hour passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the rain and the turning of my pages. Finally, he spoke, his voice muffled by the blanket. Can we just watch a movie or something? I don't want to be alone." It was the first time he had ever admitted to needing me in that way. Not for a favor, not for advice, but just for my presence. It was a crack in the armor, and I felt a dangerous, traitorous warmth spread through my chest. I put my book down and picked up the remote. We watched some mindless action movie, the kind he loved and I tolerated. He stayed on his end of the couch, and I stayed on mine. But the space between us felt different. It was charged, a vacuum that was slowly, inevitably, drawing us closer. When the movie ended, he was asleep, his head lolled back against the cushions. I watched him for a long time, the way his brow was furrowed even in sleep, the tension still clinging to him. I gently pulled the blanket up over his shoulders, my fingers brushing against his neck for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a spark in the quiet dark. I retreated to my room, my own heart a tangled mess of sympathy and a hope so fierce it terrified me. The next night, he did it again. And the night after that. It became a ritual. He'd come home from his consulting job, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with a profound lack of purpose. He had quit the swim team, of course. The pool, once his sanctuary, was now a place of failure. He'd shower, change into sweats, and then he'd gravitate to the living room, to the couch, to the space near me. At first, he maintained the pretense of distance. But slowly, imperceptibly, the chasm between our respective couch cushions began to shrink. One night, he fell asleep and his head slumped onto my shoulder. I froze, every muscle in my body screaming. I sat there for 2 hours, my arm going numb, my neck cramping, not daring to move, just breathing in the scent of his shampoo and listening to the soft rhythm of his sleep. I told myself it was for him. He was hurting, and he needed comfort, and this was what friends did. But I couldn't deny the selfish, soaring part of me that was drinking in the moment, hoarding the feeling of his weight against me. It was a dangerous cocktail of guilt and secret joy. The escalation was a masterpiece of plausible deniability. A few nights after the shoulder incident, he was particularly low. He'd spent the day fielding calls from his parents, his former coach, all asking well-meaning but agonizing questions about his future. He sat down next to me, closer than usual, and just sighed, a long, ragged sound of pure defeat. I was editing photos on my laptop, and without thinking, I reached out and started rubbing his back in slow, comforting circles. He didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, he melted into the touch, letting out another sigh, this one softer, less pained. He leaned his head back against the couch and closed his eyes. After a minute, he murmured, "That feels good. Don't stop," so I didn't. My hand kept moving, tracing the lines of his spine, feeling the tension in his shoulders slowly begin to unknot. Eventually, he shifted, turning toward me and curling up on the couch, resting his head in my lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. My laptop sat forgotten beside us. My hand moved from his back to his hair, my fingers threading through the thick, soft strands. He was asleep in minutes. This became the new normal. He would come home, we would eat, and we would migrate to the couch, where he would immediately curl up and rest his head in my lap while I read or worked or simply watched the city lights flicker to life outside our window. The nickname appeared about a week into this new, fragile intimacy. He was complaining about having to go into the office the next day, pouting in a way that was a faint echo of his old, playful self. "I don't want to go," he grumbled into my thigh. "Make them leave me alone." I laughed softly, my fingers tracing the shell of his ear. "I don't think I have that kind of power," I said. He looked up at me, his eyes half-lidded with sleepiness. "But you brought me tea. You always know what I need," he smiled then, a small, sleepy thing. "Thanks, baby." The word hung in the air between us, shimmering with ambiguity. It was a joke. It had to be. It was the kind of thing guys like Liam said, an ironic, detached term of endearment that meant nothing. I felt my face flush, and I looked away, back at my book, my heart hammering. He didn't seem to notice. He just closed his eyes again and settled deeper, completely at ease. But then he said it again the next night. And the next. It became his name for me. "Can you pass the remote, baby? What's for dinner, baby? "You tired, baby?" Each time, it landed like a stone tossed into the placid surface of my carefully managed emotions, sending ripples of confusion and hope and fear spreading through me. And as the use of baby became more frequent, the use of Julian disappeared entirely. I started to track it, a quiet, obsessive accounting in the back of my mind. It had been a week since he'd said my name. Then 2 weeks. Then 3. The absence of my own name began to feel more significant than the presence of the new one. My name was our history, our friendship, the safe, solid ground we had stood on for years. This new name, this was something else. It was a word for a different kind of relationship, a language I wasn't supposed to understand from him. It was a joke that was starting to feel terrifyingly real. My internal monologue became a constant, churning debate. One side of me, the cautious, self-protective side, insisted it was nothing. He was grieving. He was leaning on his closest friend for support, and the physical intimacy, the nickname, it was all just an expression of that need, a temporary blurring of lines that would snap back into place as soon as he started to heal. He was using me as a placeholder for a comfort he didn't know how to ask for in any other way. To read more into it was to set myself up for a devastating heartbreak. But the other side of me, the hopeful, yearning side, saw something else. It saw the way he sought me out, the way his body seemed to relax only when he was pressed against me. It heard the softness in his voice when he said the word, a tenderness that felt less like a joke and more like a habit, a truth he was speaking without realizing it. This side of me lived in a state of suspended animation, terrified to breathe too deeply for fear of shattering the delicate, beautiful illusion. The physical boundaries continued to erode, slowly and methodically. One particularly cold night, the thin blanket we usually shared felt inadequate. Liam shivered in his sleep, his hands clenched. Without making a conscious decision, I found myself pulling the large, thick comforter off my own bed. I returned to the living room and draped it over both of us. The shared space became a warm, dark cocoon. Under the cover of the heavy blanket, things shifted again. His hand, which had been resting on his own chest, uncurled and found mine. He didn't grab it. His fingers just brushed against my palm, a questioning touch. I held my breath. After a long, silent moment, I slowly, deliberately, laced my fingers with his. His hand tightened around mine, a firm, definite pressure. And that's how we slept, tangled together on the narrow couch, our hands clasped under the weight of the comforter. My mind was screaming. This was not friendship. Friends did not do this. Friends did not hold hands while they slept. Friends did not have a secret name for each other that felt more real than their actual one. But his breathing was steady against my shoulder, and his hand was warm in mine, and the world outside our small, lamplit living room seemed to fade away into irrelevance. I lived in a state of exquisite torture. Every evening was a mix of soaring hope and crushing anxiety. I would wait for him to come home, my stomach in knots. Would this be the night the spell broke? Would this be the night he sat on the other end of the couch, built the wall back up, and called me Julian again? The sound of his key in the lock was my daily verdict. But every night, he would walk in, drop his bag, and his eyes would find mine with a look of relief, of homecoming. And every night, we would end up on the couch, tangled together, his head in my lap or his back against my chest, his hands seeking mine in the dark. I started to photograph him more, not secretly, but openly. I'd be working on my laptop and he'd be asleep, his face relaxed and vulnerable in the soft light, and I'd pick up the camera that was always nearby. I was documenting the shift, creating a visual record of this strange, transitional season. The photos were different from the ones I used to take of him. They were quieter, more intimate. They weren't about the powerful athlete. They were about the curve of his neck, the way his eyelashes rested on his cheek, the utter trust in the way he gave himself over to sleep in my presence. They were portraits of a quiet, fragile becoming. I never showed them to him. I wasn't sure if they were for me or for him, or for some future version of us that I didn't dare to imagine too clearly. The days bled into weeks, and our ritual became the unchangeable center of our universe. The rest of the world seemed to operate on the periphery. His consulting work was a thing he did during the day, a story he'd tell me about later. My photography assignments were tasks to be completed so I could return to the quiet sanctuary of our apartment. We were living in a bubble of our own creation, a space defined by the dimensions of our sofa and the length of a feature film. The joke of his nickname had long since worn away, leaving behind only the raw, unnerving sincerity of it. He said it when he was tired, when he was happy, when he was sad. It was his first word to me in the morning and his last at night. And my name, Julian, became a forgotten artifact, a word from a previous life. I sometimes wondered if he even remembered it. I wondered what would happen if I said it. My name is Julian. The thought was absurd. Of course he knew my name. But the longer he went without using it, the more I felt like Julian was disappearing, replaced by this new person, baby, who existed only in the space between us, the person who was allowed to hold him, to comfort him, to be the safe harbor for his grief. I was terrified of what would happen when the grief subsided, when the storm passed, and he no longer needed the harbor. Would he sail away and leave me standing on the shore, the ghost of a name on my lips? The crossing happened on a night that was no different from any other. It was a Saturday. We had ordered Thai food and were watching a terrible sci-fi movie from the 80s, the kind with questionable special effects and even more questionable dialogue. Liam was curled against my side, his head resting on my shoulder, his leg thrown over mine. Our hands were clasped together under the blanket, a familiar, comforting weight. The movie ended, and the credits rolled, bathing the room in a soft, flickering light. Neither of us moved to turn it off. The silence that settled over us wasn't the usual sleepy, comfortable silence. It was thick and heavy, full of unspoken things. I could feel the tension in him, a sudden stillness in the way he was breathing. I could feel my own heart begin to beat faster, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen, watching the names of strangers scroll by, afraid of what I might see if I looked at him. He shifted, pulling back just enough to look at me. I finally forced myself to meet his gaze. In the dim, blue light, his eyes were dark and serious, stripped of all pretense. The air crackled. The bubble we had so carefully constructed around ourselves felt thin, fragile, about to pop. He licked his lips, a nervous gesture I had never seen from him before. His voice was barely a whisper, so quiet I almost wasn't sure I'd heard it. "Baby." "Yeah," I whispered back, my own voice tight and strained. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just watched me, his gaze searching my face as if looking for an answer to a question he hadn't yet asked. The silence stretched, pulling taut between us. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren of an ambulance, the frantic drumming of my own blood in my ears. He was so close. I could feel the warmth of his breath on my cheek. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to run. Then, he spoke again, his voice even quieter, laced with a vulnerability that shattered me. "Would it be okay?" he started, and then he hesitated, his gaze dropping to my mouth for a fraction of a second before returning to my eyes. "Would it be okay if I kissed you?" The world stopped. The refrigerator, the siren, the credits rolling on the screen, it all faded away into a dull, distant roar. There was only his question, hanging in the air between us. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was clear and direct and terrifyingly real. It was a door he was holding open, inviting me to step through. And I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that if I stepped through, there would be no going back. The old room of our friendship would be gone forever. My mind raced, a chaotic flood of all the reasons I should say no, all the ways this could end in disaster, in the complete and utter destruction of the most important person in my life. The risk was immense, a chasm at my feet. But then I looked at his face, at the fear and hope warring in his eyes, and I saw a mirror of my own. He was just as scared as I was. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. My throat was closed, tight with years of unspoken feelings. Instead, I lifted the hand that wasn't holding his and gently cupped his jaw, my thumb stroking the rough stubble along his cheek. It was an answer. It was a yes. His eyes fluttered shut, and he leaned into my touch, a soft, shaky sigh escaping his lips. And then he was closing the small distance between us. His lips met mine, and it wasn't a passionate, movie-style kiss. It was hesitant. It was soft. It was unbelievably tender. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. It tasted of salt and uncertainty and a desperate, fragile hope. It was the most honest thing that had ever passed between us. I felt years of carefully constructed walls crumble into dust, years of quiet yearning finally finding a voice, a home. I kissed him back, pouring every unspoken word, every secret photograph, every moment of quiet longing into that single, gentle press of our lips. When we finally pulled apart, we just stayed there, our foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same air. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty or tense. It was full. It was a quiet, shared space of understanding. He had crossed the line, and I had met him there. And we were standing on new ground. The morning after was a brutal, jarring return to reality. I woke up alone on the couch, the comforter twisted around my legs. The apartment was silent. A cold, gray light filtered through the windows, making everything look stark and unfamiliar. For a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. The question, the kiss. But the phantom feeling of his lips on mine was still there, a warm, tender echo. I sat up, my heart a confusing mix of elation and a new, creeping dread. I heard a noise from the kitchen and I walked in, my steps hesitant. Liam was standing at the counter, his back to me, already dressed in his running gear. He was pouring coffee into a travel mug, his movements stiff and jerky. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice light, casual. He flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of his shoulders. He didn't turn around. "Hey," he mumbled into the counter. The space between us, which had been so full of a new, fragile intimacy just hours before, was now a cold, yawning void. The air was thick with things unsaid, with the ghost of our kiss. I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed over my chest, a feeble attempt at armor. I waited for him to say something, anything, to look at me. But he just kept his back to me, screwing the lid onto his mug with unnecessary force. "I'm going for a run," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. "Liam," I started, but he was already moving, striding past me without a glance, grabbing his keys from the hook by the door. He didn't look at me. He didn't call me baby. He didn't call me anything. He just left, the soft click of the door closing behind him feeling like a gunshot in the silent apartment. I stood there for a long time, the cold from the floor seeping into my bare feet. The hope that had soared so high just hours ago came crashing down, leaving me breathless and aching. I had been a fool. The cautious, self-protective part of my brain screamed, "I told you so." It had been a mistake. A moment of grief-fueled confusion for him, a catastrophic miscalculation for me. He was regretting it. He was running from it, from me, as fast as he could. The pain was sharp and immediate, a physical blow to the chest. It was so much worse than the quiet, manageable ache of my old, secret love. This was the agony of a hope realized and then snatched away. When he came back an hour later, things were no better. He was drenched in sweat, his face flushed from exertion, but his eyes were still distant, guarded. He went straight to the shower, and the sound of the water running felt like a wall between us. The rest of the day was a masterclass in avoidance. He stayed in his room, the door pointedly closed. When he did emerge, for food or water, he moved through our shared spaces like a ghost, his gaze fixed on the floor, on the walls, on anything but me. He answered my tentative questions with monosyllabic grunts. The silence in the apartment was deafening. It was a hostile, aggressive silence, so different from the comfortable, easy quiet we had shared for years. Every unspoken word was a fresh wound. I felt like I was losing my mind, replaying the kiss over and over again, searching for the moment I had misread everything so completely. Had I imagined the tenderness, the vulnerability in his eyes? Or was this fear? Was he so terrified of what had happened between us that his only response was to pretend it didn't exist? This painful, silent standoff lasted for 3 days. 3 days of living with a stranger who looked like my best friend. 3 days of sleeping alone in my own bed, the cold sheets a constant reminder of the warmth I had lost. The couch in the living room sat empty, a monument to our broken ritual. I couldn't eat. I couldn't work. I would sit in my darkroom, the red light bathing everything in a bloody glow, and just stare at the trays of chemicals, the images of him I had developed floating in my mind. The trust in his sleeping face, the intimacy I had captured, it all felt like a lie now. A story I had told myself. The anxiety and hurt curdled into a slow, simmering anger. I was angry at him for his cowardice, for refusing to even speak to me. But mostly, I was angry at myself for letting my guard down, for daring to believe that I could have something so beautiful. On the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. The silence was going to break me. He was in the kitchen, making a sandwich, his movements still clipped and avoidant. I walked in and stood in the doorway, blocking his exit. He froze, his hand hovering over the bread, but he still wouldn't look at me. "We have to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He shook his head, a small, tight motion. "There's nothing to talk about. Nothing to talk about." The words came out sharper than I intended. "You kiss me, and then you spend 3 days treating me like I don't exist, and you think there's nothing to talk about." He finally looked up, and the anguish in his eyes was so profound it stole my breath. He looked cornered, terrified. "I can't," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Jules, I can't do this." He had used my name. Julian. It should have been a relief, a return to solid ground. But the way he said it, it sounded like a goodbye. It was the name of the friend whose boundaries he had crossed and now desperately wanted to rebuild. The pain was so sharp, so blinding, I had to fight to speak through it. "You can't do what, Liam?" I pushed, my voice rising. "You can't talk to me? You can't look at me? Or you can't admit that what happened between us meant something? What are you so afraid of?" "I'm not afraid," he snapped, his own voice rising to meet mine, a flash of his old fire mixed with pure panic. I'm not. This was a mistake, okay? It was a mistake. I was messed up, I was lonely, and I used you. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Jules. I never should have. We should just forget it ever happened." Every word was a hammer blow. A mistake. I used you. He was trying to give me an out, trying to cauterize the wound with a lie we could both agree to believe. He was trying to save our friendship by pretending the most honest moment we'd ever shared was a moment of weakness, a temporary insanity. But I couldn't accept it. It was an insult to me, and more importantly, it was an insult to him, to the truth I had seen in his eyes. "Don't you dare," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "Don't you dare try to cheapen what happened. Don't you stand there and tell me that was nothing. I know you. I know you better than anyone. And I know you don't do things you don't mean. You were not using me." I took a step closer, invading his space, forcing him to see me. "You've been calling me baby for a month. You haven't said my name in weeks. You have slept in my arms every single night. That is not nothing, that is not a mistake. So stop hiding behind these pathetic excuses and tell me the truth. What are you so afraid of?" He stared at me, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His face was a mask of conflict, of terror and confusion and a deep, gut-wrenching sadness. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a wave of empathy so strong it almost buckled my knees. He wasn't being cruel. He was drowning. He had spent his entire life in a world of straight lines. The black lines on the bottom of the pool, the clear finish line, the simple binary of win or lose. His identity was built on that certainty. And our kiss, had thrown him into a world without lines, an open ocean of terrifying possibilities, and he didn't know how to swim. His composure finally broke. A single tear tracked a path through the grime on his cheek, then another. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "I don't know," he choked out, the words ripped from him. "I don't know what I am. I don't know what this is. All I know is that for the past month, the only time I've felt okay, the only time I haven't felt like I'm a complete and utter failure, is when I'm with you, on the couch. And that night, when I kissed you, it was the first thing that's felt right in so long. It felt like coming home." His voice broke completely, and he covered his face with his hands, his body shaking with ragged, silent sobs. "And that terrifies me, Jules. It terrifies me." My own anger dissolved, washed away by the raw, painful honesty of his confession. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a truth he didn't have the language or the courage to face. I closed the remaining distance between us and wrapped my arms around him, pulling him into a hug. He resisted for a second, his body stiff with tension, and then he just collapsed against me, burying his face in my shoulder, his sobs turning into audible, gut-wrenching sounds of grief and relief. I held him, my hand stroking the back of his head, just holding him together as he finally fell apart. "It's okay," I murmured into his hair, my own tears starting to fall. "It's okay. I'm right here. You don't have to have the answers. We can figure it out together. We stood there in the middle of our kitchen for a long time, clinging to each other like two survivors of a shipwreck. The hostile silence was gone, replaced by the messy, honest sounds of two people finally telling the truth. The fight was over. The real work, the slow, patient work of healing and building something new, was just beginning. The aftermath of that confrontation was not a sudden, magical fix. There were no grand declarations or easy resolutions. Instead, it was a quiet, tentative recalibration. We began to talk, really talk, not just about the weather or our work, but about our fears, about the kiss, about the strange and beautiful and terrifying thing that had grown between us and the ruins of his old life. Liam's confession hadn't been a neat, tidy explanation. It was a jumble of confusion, fear, and a deep, undeniable affection for me that he was only just beginning to put a name to. He had spent his life seeing the world in black and white, and the sudden explosion of color was disorienting. He was afraid of what people would think, his parents, his old teammates. He was afraid of what this meant for his own identity, an identity he had never once questioned. My role, I realized, was to be patient. My love for him had been a quiet, slow-growing thing for years. I could afford to give him the time and space to let his own feelings catch up. I had to be the harbor I had always been, but this time, with the lighthouse on, showing him a clear and steady path home. We didn't immediately go back to the couch ritual. The space was too charged, too full of the memory of the kiss and the painful silence that followed. Instead, we found a new rhythm. We started taking long walks in the evenings, wandering through the city streets with no destination in mind. On these walks, side by side, not touching, it was easier for him to talk. He didn't have to look at me, and the motion seemed to loosen the words from his throat. He talked about the suffocating pressure of his swimming career, the feeling that his worth as a person was tied to a number on a stopwatch. He admitted that his string of girlfriends had always felt performative. He had liked them, but he had never felt the profound sense of rightness, of home, that he had felt sleeping in my arms. I listened. I didn't push or label. I just listened, offering quiet affirmations, letting him map out his own new territory at his own pace. And I talked too. I told him about my years of quiet pining, about the secret ache I had carried. I confessed how terrified I had been of ruining our friendship, the most precious thing in my life. Laying our truths bare like that was frightening, but it was also liberating. It cleared the air between us, sweeping away the dust of unspoken things and plausible deniability. We were building a new foundation, one based not on assumptions and secret hopes, but on a fragile, radical honesty. The physical intimacy returned slowly, tentatively. It started with small things. A hand brushing his as we walked, me reaching out to fix his collar, him leaning against me for a moment longer than necessary when we were looking at something on my computer screen. Each touch was a question and an answer, a small reaffirmation. About a week after our fight, we were sitting in the living room, a careful foot of space between us on the couch. We were watching a movie, and I felt him looking at me. I turned, and his expression was soft, questioning. "Can I?" he started, and then trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the space beside me. I knew what he was asking. He was asking for permission to return, to come back to the comfort and safety he had found there. I didn't say anything. I just lifted my arm and opened my side to him. He moved into the space like a sigh of relief, curling up against me, his head finding its familiar place on my shoulder. It was different this time. There was no ambiguity, no pretense. It wasn't a friend seeking mindless comfort. It was him, choosing to be here, with me. I rested my cheek against the top of his head, breathing him in. He was home. He didn't use my name, but he didn't use the nickname, either. He didn't call me anything. We existed in a space of quiet action. A few nights later, as we were falling asleep on the couch, tangled together under the comforter, he whispered into the darkness. "Jules." The sound of my own name, after so long, was a shock. It felt both strange and wonderful. "Yeah," I whispered back. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Us. Like this. Is it okay with you?" I tightened my arm around him, pulling him closer. "It's more than okay, Liam." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, so softly I could barely hear it, "Okay. Good." And then, a moment later, a sleepy, contented murmur against my collarbone. Night, baby. The word was back, but it was transformed. It wasn't a joke, and it wasn't a placeholder. It was an endearment. It was his. It was ours. It landed not with a jolt of anxiety, but with a profound sense of peace. It was the name for the person I was with him, in this new, honest space we were creating. Julian was the friend, the roommate, the person the rest of the world knew. Baby was the person who held him in the dark, the one who knew the shape of his fears, the one who was his harbor. And I was learning that I could be both. Our new normal was quiet and domestic and more beautiful than anything I had ever dared to hope for. It was in the way he started leaving his toothbrush next to mine, not on the other side of the counter. It was in the way I started making coffee for two every morning without thinking. It was in the nights we forewent the couch and ended up in my bed, not for any reason other than the simple, profound desire to be close to one another. There was a peace to it, a rightness that settled deep in my bones. The frantic energy that had always surrounded Liam was gone, replaced by a calm, steady warmth. He was still figuring himself out, and we still had conversations that were difficult and uncertain. But the terror had receded, replaced by a quiet courage. He was learning to swim in the open ocean, and he was learning that he wasn't alone. One afternoon, I was in my darkroom, developing the photos I had taken of him during that strange, transitional time. The images emerged slowly in the chemical bath, his face, soft with sleep, resting in my lap, his hand, slack and trusting, lying on the couch cushions next to mine. He came in, knocking softly on the door before slipping inside, letting the thick curtain fall behind him. He was used to the dim red light of my workspace. He came and stood beside me, watching the images appear in the tray. He was silent for a long time, just watching himself through my eyes. I felt a flicker of my old anxiety. These were from before, from the time of uncertainty. He pointed to a photo of himself curled up on the couch, his face half hidden in the crook of my arm. "I look peaceful," he said, his voice full of wonder. "You were," I said. He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing with mine. He looked from the photos to me, his eyes clear and certain in the crimson glow. "It was because of you," he said, simply. "I was a wreck. I was lost. And you were just there. You were so patient. You let me be a mess. You made me feel safe." He brought my hand to his lips and kissed my knuckles. "You saved me, baby." And in that moment, standing in the quiet, creative darkness of my own small sanctuary, I understood. The currents of our lives had turned, slowly and inexorably, pulling us away from the familiar shore of our friendship and out into something deeper, vaster, and infinitely more beautiful. We hadn't been washed away. We had simply been guided to a new shore, one we had built together out of patience and honesty and a love that had finally learned to speak its own name. We were healing, not in the bright, harsh light of the world's expectations, but in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. And it was just the beginning.